You turn the key in a car that should absolutely not start. The paint is 3 different shades of beige. The driver's seat has collapsed into something between furniture and a warning. The dashboard is cracked like a dry lake bed. There is a smell in there that cannot be identified by science, law enforcement, or any living mechanic. And yet, one crank later, the engine coughs, shudders, complains to management, and then settles into an idle like it has been personally insulted by your lack of faith. That is the kind of car we are talking about today. Not show cars, not garage queens, not polished museum pieces sitting under soft lighting while someone whispers about provenance. I mean the battered survivors. The cars with 400,000 miles, missing hubcaps, sunburned paint, and a check engine light that either burned out in 1997 or achieved inner peace. These are the mechanical cockroaches. Ugly? Sometimes. Loud? Often. Comfortable? Depends how much spinal ambition you have. But durable? Absurdly durable. The kind of machine that looks like it was assembled during a lunch break, then somehow outlives 3 owners, 2 recessions, 1 teenager learning clutch control, and every reasonable expectation of mercy. And here is the thing. These old cars did not survive because they were magical. They survived because many of them were built with a kind of engineering restraint that feels almost illegal now. Big, lazy engines that were not stressed to within an inch of their lives. Thick metal where thick metal mattered. Simple fuel systems, transmissions that shifted like farm equipment but refused to die. Suspensions you could rebuild with hand tools, patience, and language not suitable for church. Nothing was trying to be a smartphone. Nothing needed a software update to open the glove box. If something broke, you could usually see it, reach it, hit it, replace it, or threaten it into cooperating. Revolutionary concept, right? Some of these cars were overbuilt because manufacturers had reputations to protect. Some were simple because simplicity was cheaper. Some were tough almost by accident, like the engineers accidentally made a rolling anvil and then said, good enough, ship it. But the result was the same. Cars that did not just age, they endured. Meanwhile, plenty of newer, shinier machines have folded like wet cardboard because one tiny plastic sensor decided it no longer believed in employment. Progress is wonderful until your climate control module costs more than an entire running sedan from 1988. So the question is not just which old cars lasted the longest. That is too easy. Mileage legends are everywhere if you know where to look. The real question is why. Were these old cars actually built to last forever, or did they survive because they were simple enough to outstubborn the people who owned them? Because real durability is not always glamorous. Sometimes it is boring, sometimes it is heavy, sometimes it is a cheap interior wrapped around a drivetrain that could probably survive being dropped off a loading dock. And when the apocalypse comes, do not be shocked if the last thing moving is not a supercar. It will be a faded sedan with one working speaker, a sticky gas pedal, and an engine that sounds like a coffee can full of bolts. So what separates a merely old car from one that seems personally offended by the concept of death? That is where the myth gets slippery. Because whenever somebody says they do not make them like they used to, half the room nods like we are discussing ancient wisdom, and the other half remembers cars that dissolved in winter, overheated in traffic, leaked oil like a nervous squid, and had electrical systems designed by someone who hated weekends. Both sides are right. I am Ben from USA Classic Cars, and I am not here to stand in front of a velvet robe and whisper reverently about chrome trim. I am here as the guy leaning over an old engine bay, pointing at a greasy piece of metal and saying, see, this is why it still works. Because this is not a love letter to every old car ever made. No, absolutely not. Plenty of old cars were terrible. Some were rust buckets with headlights. Some were fire hazards with ashtrays. Some were rolling regret with vinyl seats, drum brakes, and the crash protection of a folding lawn chair. Nostalgia has a way of sanding off the bad parts, which is convenient because a lot of those bad parts were literally sanding off themselves in the driveway. So when we talk about cars that were built to last forever, we are not saying the past was perfect. We are saying a few machines got the recipe right, and the recipe was usually not glamorous. It was not magic steel from a secret mountain. It was not an engineer in a lab coat sprinkling immortality dust over a crankstand. It was simpler than that, and much more annoying for modern car makers. Understressed engines, simple drivetrains, big cooling systems, cheap replacement parts, thick construction where it mattered, enough space under the hood would for an adult human hand, not just the emotional memory of one. That stuff adds up. An engine making modest power from generous displacement does not have to live its whole life screaming for help. A transmission built with conservative tolerances does not grenade itself because somebody missed one fluid change by 3 months. A suspension made from simple, replaceable parts can be rebuilt in a garage instead of diagnosed by a laptop, a subscription service, and an emotional support technician named Kyle. And here's the real trick. Durability is not just about surviving abuse. It is about surviving ownership, because owners are chaos. Owners skip maintenance. Owners use the wrong oil. Owners ignore noises until the noise becomes a percussion section. Owners say, "It has always done that," while the car is actively begging for legal representation. A forever car has to tolerate people. That is why repairability matters just as much as strength. If a fuel pump costs $20 and takes 30 minutes, the car gets fixed. If the same problem requires removing half the front of the vehicle, scanning 4 modules, and sacrificing a Saturday to the plastic clip gods, the car gets parked behind a shed and slowly becomes real estate. The great survivors made it easy to keep going, not always pleasant, not always quiet, definitely not always safe by modern standards, but fixable, understandable, forgiving. And that is the part the slogan misses. They do not make them like they used to. Sounds like a complaint about quality. Sometimes it is really a complaint about complexity. Modern cars can be astonishing, faster, cleaner, safer, more comfortable, and full of features that would have made a 1970s luxury buyer faint directly into his cigarette lighter. But when everything is integrated, sealed, coded, sensor monitored, and buried under decorative plastic, one small failure can feel like the car hired a lawyer against you. Old, durable cars had fewer tricks. That was the trick. They were not trying to optimize every last mile per gallon, every last horsepower, every last luxury feature, every last committee-approved convenience. Many of them were designed with slack in the system, margin, breathing room, the mechanical equivalent of buying boots one size too big because you know the road is going to get ugly. So this countdown is not just 10 old cars people remember fondly. Each one represents a different flavor of immortality. Some are cheap people's cars that survived because parts were everywhere and nobody was afraid to wrench on them. Some are luxury tanks built like the engineers expected a diplomatic incident. Some are global workhorses that cross deserts, farms, cities, and war zones with the general attitude of a refrigerator being pushed downhill. Different countries, different purposes, same lesson. The cars that last usually do not win by being fancy. They win by being honest. They do a job, they do not ask for much, and when they break, they let you fight back with tools you can actually hold. So before the first car, we need one rule book, because forever cars usually share the same boring little secrets. Here is the forever car formula. First, the engine has to be lazy, not weak, lazy. There is a difference. A durable engine is usually doing less than it could. It is not wringing its own neck every time you merge onto the highway. It has modest compression, conservative horsepower, thick internal parts, and enough cooling to survive a July traffic jam without turning the temperature gauge into a distress flare. That matters because stress is what turns metal into confetti. If an engine is designed to make heroic power from tiny displacement, with heat everywhere, boost everywhere, sensors everywhere, and tolerances tighter than a tax audit, it might be brilliant. It might also decide that one neglected oil change is treason. A forever engine shrugs. It runs a little dirty, a little noisy, maybe with the emotional range of a cement mixer, but it keeps moving. Second, the transmission cannot be a drama queen. The best long-life cars usually had gearboxes that were simple, proven, and not trying to reinvent physics before breakfast. A basic manual transmission, a stout old automatic, gears, fluid, shafts, clutches, bands, things that make sense when you look at them. The bad version is a transmission so clever it needs software, prayers, and a dealership computer to explain why reverse has left the chat. And once that happens, the whole car changes. It is not transportation anymore. It is a very expensive statue with cup holders. Third, the chassis has to forgive bad roads and bad decisions. Strong frames, tough unibody structures, simple suspension layouts, big bushings, replaceable ball joints, parts that can be removed without dismantling the entire front half of civilization. That is not glamorous engineering. Nobody hangs a poster of a control arm on their bedroom wall, probably. But that stuff is what keeps a car from being thrown away when the roads get rough, the mileage gets stupid, and the owner keeps saying, "I will fix that next month," for 3 years. Fourth, the electronics need to know their place. Lights, ignition, charging, basic fuel delivery, fine. But when every handle, pump, vent, switch, lock, seat motor, window relay, and dashboard mood lamp is tied into a network of modules that all speak fluent panic, one tiny fault can start a committee meeting under the hood. Old durable cars were not immune to electrical problems. They just had electrical problems you could chase with a test light and a bad attitude. That is the difference. A complicated car can be objectively better in almost every measurable way, right up until one invisible gremlin turns it into driveway sculpture. A simple car can be slow, loud, drafty, and deeply uninterested in your comfort, and still get you to work for 35 years because there are fewer ways for it to ruin your morning. And the final ingredient is parts. A car does not last forever because nothing breaks. That is fantasy. Everything breaks. Rubber cracks, bearings wear, seals leak, plastic becomes sadness. A car lasts forever when the broken thing is cheap, available, and reachable. If the starter is right there, it gets replaced. If the water pump is affordable, it gets replaced. If the alternator can be swapped in a driveway before dinner, the car lives another decade. That is not romance. That is logistics. Durability is often the art of saying no. No fragile gimmicks, no experimental nonsense, no engineering equivalent of putting fireworks in a toaster just because marketing wanted a new button. The great old survivors were not perfect machines. They were restrained machines. They were built with room for heat, room for wear, room for imperfect fuel, imperfect roads, imperfect owners, and imperfect repairs done under a flickering garage light while somebody mutters words that should not be printed in a service manual. So were these old cars actually built to last forever? Not exactly. They were built simple enough, strong enough, and repairable enough to outstubborn the people who owned them, and no car proved the power of simple, stubborn engineering, quite like the little machine that put half the planet on wheels. That machine was the Volkswagen Beetle, and the Beetle did not survive because it was the best car in the world. Let us be honest. It was slow, it was noisy, it had the aerodynamic profile of a cough drop. The heater worked with the confidence of a damp candle, and if you wanted luxury, the Beetle responded by giving you a steering wheel, some pedals, and a sincere suggestion to lower your expectations. But durability? That little bug was ridiculous. The secret was not exotic materials or some mystical German wizardry hidden inside the engine case. The secret was that the Beetle was simple almost to the point of comedy. At the back, you had an air-cooled flat-4 engine, no radiator, no water pump, no coolant hoses snaking around like rubber spaghetti, no thermostat housing waiting to crack at the worst possible moment, no complex cooling plumbing to betray you in traffic like a tiny mechanical Judas. Air came in, heat went out, the engine made a noise like an angry sewing machine in a metal lunchbox, and the car moved. Revolutionary concept, right? Now, air-cooled engines have their own problems. They can overheat, they need proper tin work, they do not enjoy being ignored forever by someone who thinks oil changes are a government conspiracy. But compared with a typical water-cooled setup, there were simply fewer parts involved in the whole "please do not cook yourself" operation. And fewer systems meant fewer failure points. That was the Beetle's whole personality. The suspension was basic, the body was basic, the interior was basic. The mechanical layout was so straightforward that generations of owners learned to fix them with hand tools, a greasy manual, and the emotional support of a neighbor named Gary who used to have one of these. And because Volkswagen built millions of them, the Beetle developed something even more powerful than reliability: infrastructure. Parts were everywhere. Used engines were everywhere. Mechanics knew them. Backyard tinkerers knew them. Entire communities knew them. If something broke, the answer was rarely, "Well, I guess the car is dead." It was usually, "Fine, order the part, move that toolbox, and somebody find a 10mm wrench." Keeping one alive became almost a community sport. That matters because a car does not become legendary just by refusing to brake. It becomes legendary when, after it brakes, everyone knows exactly how to bring it back. The Beetle was not fast enough to scare anything except maybe a steep hill. It was not quiet, it was not refined, it did not pamper you. It was transportation reduced to its most stubborn possible form. 4 wheels, 1 engine, minimal nonsense. And that is why the Beetle lasted. Not because it was perfect, but because it was humble enough to be repaired, simple enough to be understood, and common enough that the world accidentally built a support network around it. But if the Beetle was the tiny survivor, the next car was the one that handled bad roads like the road had personally insulted its family. That car was the Peugeot 504. And if the Beetle was a little mechanical cockroach, the Peugeot 504 was a steel-toed boot with headlights. It was not glamorous. It was not futuristic. Nobody looked at a dusty 504 taxi with mismatched doors and thought, ah yes, European elegance. They thought, that thing has seen 3 governments collapse and still has a fare to collect. And that is exactly why it became a legend. Peugeot launched the 504 in the late 1960s, and on paper it was just a sensible family car. A front-engine, rear-wheel drive sedan, clean lines, comfortable seats, decent engines, very French in that understated, slightly serious way, like it wanted a cigarette and a discussion about road surfaces. But here is where it gets interesting. The 504 did not build its reputation in perfect suburbs with smooth driveways and owners who polished the wheel arches on Sunday. No, it earned it on broken roads, dirt tracks, desert heat, overloaded taxi routes, and places where pavement was less a surface and more of a rumor. In parts of Africa, the Middle East, and South America, the 504 became the kind of car people trusted because it could take punishment without immediately filing for retirement. You could load it with passengers, luggage, livestock-adjacent cargo, possibly someone's entire small business, and send it down a road that looked like it had been assembled during an earthquake. And the Peugeot would just go, fine. The secret was not one magical part. It was the combination. The suspension was tough and long travel enough to absorb ugly roads without turning every pothole into a court case. The structure was sturdy. The engines, especially the simpler gasoline and diesel versions, were not delicate little jewelry boxes full of panic. They were honest machines. They made power, used fuel, got hot, got dusty, and generally kept their drama to a minimum. Revolutionary concept, right? And when something did go wrong, the 504 did not require a priest, a laptop, and a climate-controlled dealership with espresso in the waiting room. It could be worked on. It could be patched. It could be coaxed back into service by mechanics who understood the machine and had no interest in hearing excuses from it. That is the part people forget about durability. A car does not need to be unbreakable. Nothing is unbreakable, especially not after 20 years of taxi duty, bad fuel, brutal heat, and roads that treat suspension bushings like snack food. It needs to fail in ways humans can fight. The 504 did that. Parts could be replaced, panels could be repaired, engines could be kept alive. The car was simple enough to understand and strong enough to justify the effort. That is why so many of them lived hard lives instead of pretty ones. Some cars age like milk. They get weird, fragile, expensive, and somehow offended by sunlight. The Peugeot 504 aged like a work boot, scuffed, faded, maybe not something you would wear to a wedding, but more convincing with every scar. And in taxi form, that image became almost mythical. A 504 with sagging springs, sun-baked paint, a roof rack loaded like a small apartment, and an engine note that sounded tired but not defeated, not elegant, useful. There is a difference. The 504 was not built to impress people who measured durability by how softly a door closed in a showroom. It was built with enough restraint, enough strength, and enough mechanical common sense to survive owners who had no choice but to use it hard. And that is why it belongs here, because real toughness is not always shiny. Sometimes it is dusty, dented, overloaded, and still somehow accepting another passenger. And then Japan looked at durability and said, cute, what if we made reliability boring, affordable, and terrifyingly consistent? The Honda Accord did not arrive like a hero. It arrived like like a refrigerator with turn signals. Sensible shape, sensible seats, sensible fuel economy. The kind of car bought by people who read the owner's manual, compared insurance quotes, and thought sporty meant the radio had presets. And then, somehow, these things started refusing to die. That was the trick with the classic Accord. It was not built to be dramatic. It was built to start every morning, sip fuel, sit in traffic without having a nervous breakdown, and make neglect look a lot less fatal than it should have been. Not harmless, less fatal. Big difference. By the late 1970s and through the 1980s and 1990s, the Accord became one of those cars that quietly rewired what people expected from a daily driver. Before that, plenty of family cars were treated like temporary appliances. You drove them until the body sagged, the engine got tired, the transmission started speaking in riddles, and then you sent them away. The Accord looked at that life cycle and said, what if I simply did not? The real magic was Honda's engineering restraint. These were not giant engines trying to shove a heavy couch down the interstate. Honda used small, efficient engines that were well machined, happy to rev, and built with the kind of precision that made them feel smoother than they had any right to be. And the cars were light. That matters. A lighter car is kinder to everything. The engine is not dragging a piano uphill. The brakes are not trying to stop a moving apartment building. The suspension is not being beaten like it owes money. Every part gets an easier life, and over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, that adds up. This is why Accords could pile on mileage in a way that seemed almost rude. Change the oil, keep coolant in it, do the timing belt when you were supposed to. Give it spark plugs once in a while. Revolutionary concept, right? Do that, and the car would often go 200,000 miles like it was just warming up. But here is where it gets funny. Even when owners were not perfect, the Accord was weirdly forgiving. Not invincible, not magical, but forgiving. It would develop a squeak, a leak, a rattle, a warning sign from the mechanical gods, and then continue commuting like a tired employee who had already put in the vacation request and been denied. That is why people trusted them. The Accord did not need to impress you in the first 10 minutes. It impressed you in year 12. When the paint was dull, the seat fabric looked like an exhausted motel couch, and the engine still fired on a cold morning with the emotional intensity of a toaster. Of course, they had problems. Rust was the big villain, especially in salty places where winter roads turned rocker panels into cornflakes. Wheel arches, floors, rear quarters, all the usual horror zones. Mechanically immortal does not help much if the body is trying to return to the earth one flaky orange chunk at a time. And timing belts, oh buddy, ignore one of those long enough and the engine might not gently remind you. It might convert your affordable commute into an expensive lesson with valves involved. That was not Honda being cruel. That was maintenance being maintenance. But compared with a lot of cars from the same era, the Accord gave owners a fighting chance. It was simple enough to service, efficient enough to run cheaply, and engineered well enough that basic care actually mattered. That sounds obvious now, but at the time it was a revelation disguised as beige transportation. The Accord became immortal by accident only in the sense that nobody bought one expecting a legend. They bought a practical car. Then it kept showing up at work, at school, in grocery store parking lots, on its third owner, then its fourth, with mismatched hubcaps, a dented fender, and an engine bay that looked dusty but deeply unbothered. That is the difference between excitement and trust. Excitement gets you to buy the car. Trust makes you tell your neighbor, honestly, just get an Accord. And millions of people did, because real durability is not always a giant frame, a huge engine, or some dramatic reputation forged in mud and fire. Sometimes it is a small four-cylinder, a sensible curb weight, good machining, and the glorious refusal to make everything more complicated than it needs to be. But if the Accord made reliability feel polished, Toyota made it feel inevitable. Toyota looked at the Accord and said cute. Then it built the Corolla, a car so aggressively uninterested in drama that calling it transportation almost feels too emotional. The Corolla was not trying to be loved. It was trying to be purchased, fueled, ignored, repaired cheaply, and then handed to somebody's nephew with 180,000 miles on it and a cassette stuck in the radio. And that was the genius. Toyota treated excitement like a warranty risk. If a part did not need to be fancy, it was not fancy. If an engine did not need to make heroic power, it did not make heroic power. If a transmission could do its job with the mechanical complexity of a garden gate, wonderful. Ship it. This was not a dream car. This was a refrigerator with headlights, but refrigerators work. That was kind of the point. The old Corolla formula was almost insultingly simple. Small 4-cylinder engines, modest horsepower, lightweight, manual transmissions that felt like they were assembled by people who believed gears were sacred objects. Automatic transmissions that, while not exciting, usually did not wake up every morning plotting financial violence. Nothing was being pushed to the edge. The engine was not sweating through a gym towel trying to move a 2-ton luxury barge. The brakes were not stopping a municipal building. The suspension was not controlling the body roll of a cruise ship in a hurricane. Everything had an easier job. That is the unglamorous secret of durability. When you understress parts, they last longer. Shocking, I know. Somewhere an engineer just dropped a clipboard, and Toyota was very, very good at making the same kind of thing the same way over and over again. That matters more than people think. A durable design is great. A durable design built inconsistently is just a lottery ticket with wheel covers. Toyota's production system focused on repeatability, quality control, and catching problems before they became your problem in a parking lot during rain. The result was a car that did not feel special when new, but became deeply annoying to kill. You could neglect one. Not forever. Do not get brave. But if you changed the oil, replaced the timing belt on the engines that used one, kept coolant in it, and did not treat the clutch like a campfire, the Corolla would often keep going with the calm confidence of a machine that had already seen your bad decisions and budgeted for them. And because Toyota sold Corollas everywhere, the support network became part of the durability. Parts were cheap, mechanics knew them, junkyards had them. Your neighbor's cousin probably had 3 of them in various stages of becoming lawn furniture. That created a loop. The car was worth fixing because fixing it was cheap. It stayed on the road because parts were available. Mechanics could diagnose it quickly because they had seen the same issue 4,000 times. Then the car survived long enough to become worthless on paper, but priceless to the person who needed to get to work. At some point, the resale value became approximately one nice dinner. And people still fixed them. That tells you everything. A Corolla with faded paint, one missing hubcap, and seats upholstered in whatever fabric Toyota apparently sourced from a high school backpack could still be a perfectly rational car. Not stylish, not fast, not even remotely cool, unless you have reached the advanced age where reliability becomes attractive, which happens to all of us eventually. Usually after one repair bill with a comma in it. Were they perfect? No. Rust could eat them. Interiors could get sun-baked into sadness. Old carbureted versions could be fussy if ignored. Rubber dries out, bushings wear, radiators crack, and time remains undefeated because time is rude. But the Corolla made repairs feel possible instead of catastrophic. That is the difference. Some cars fail like a court summons. The Corolla failed like a light bulb. Annoying, inconvenient, but you probably knew where to get the part by lunchtime. So were these old cars built to last forever? Not literally. They survived because Toyota kept them simple enough, light enough, common enough, and conservatively engineered enough to outstubborn the people who owned them. Real durability is not magic. It is restraint. It is repairability. It is not making every component perform circus tricks when all it needs to do is work. And the Corolla worked. Again, and again, and again. Then Sweden entered the chat and said, "What if boring, but square, heavy, and possibly able to stop a small asteroid?" And Sweden did not just enter the chat. Sweden kicked the door open wearing snow boots, carrying a crash test dummy, and asking why everyone else was building cars shaped like emotions. The Volvo 240 was not merely a car. It was a rectangular life decision with wheels. This thing looked like it had been designed using a ruler, a safety manual, and mild suspicion of curves. No swoops, no drama, no European flair. Just 4 doors, a hood, a trunk, and the aerodynamic profile of a filing cabinet falling down a staircase. And somehow, that was exactly the point. Volvo was not trying to build the sexiest sedan in the parking lot. Volvo was building something that could haul a family through snow, bad roads, moose-adjacent panic, and the kind of weather that makes other cars file a complaint with human resources. The 240 ran from the 1970s into the 1990s, which is already ridiculous. Most cars get redesigned because fashion changes. The 240 looked at fashion and said, "No thank you, I have structural priorities." The secret was not magic. It was conservative engineering. Front engine, rear-wheel drive, strong unibody construction, tough axles, big glass, simple suspension, engine bays with actual space around the engine, so a human hand could reach things without needing the wrist flexibility of a carnival contortionist. Revolutionary concept, right? And then there were the engines. Volvo's old red block 4-cylinders were not glamorous. They did not sing opera. They did not make teenagers point from sidewalks. They made modest power, burned fuel, tolerated abuse, and often kept running with the grim determination of farm equipment that had seen things. They were iron block, understressed, and built for service. Timing belts needed doing. Fluids mattered. Sensors and wiring could age. But the basic engine was not some fragile jewel box where one bad afternoon turned into a mortgage event. It was a machine you could understand, reach, diagnose, and fix. That matters. Because durability is not just surviving. It is being worth repairing after something finally wears out. A car can be strong and still become disposable if every repair requires 3 special tools, a laptop, and a technician whispering to it in German. The 240 was different. Mechanics knew them. Owners learned them. Parts support stayed strong. The car invited maintenance instead of punishing it, and safety was baked into the whole personality. Volvo built its reputation on protecting people before marketing departments discovered that active lifestyle meant putting black plastic trim on everything. The 240 had serious crash structure, big bumpers in earlier versions, strong pillars, and an overall sense that it had been engineered by people who believed accidents were not hypothetical. So the shape made sense. That upright greenhouse gave visibility. The square body made packaging easy. The simple layout made repairs easier. The heavy structure made the car feel planted and secure. It was not pretty in the normal way. It was pretty the way a bank vault is pretty. You do not flirt with it. You trust it. And because Volvo prioritized safety and longevity over chasing trends, the 240 became one of those cars people kept far past the point where normal transportation becomes a financial argument. It survived college students, winter salt, gravel roads, cheap gas, bad parking, owners who treated oil changes like a philosophical debate instead of a calendar event. Not forever. Do not start writing angry comments from underneath a rusty wagon. Rust absolutely could attack these cars, especially in salty climates. Floors, rockers, wheel arches, and lower body sections could all suffer if neglected. Rubber aged, electrical gremlins appeared, automatic transmissions needed care. Suspension bushings did not last until the heat death of the universe. Nothing does. But a well-kept Volvo 240 could feel like it was plotting to outlive the garage. That is what made it special. It was not fast. It was not luxurious. It was not trying to impress anybody at a stoplight. It was built around the boring stuff that actually keeps a car alive. Space to work, parts that are not stressed to death, systems that make sense, and a body designed by people who clearly expected the commute to include elk, snow, and minor warfare. The Volvo 240 proved that longevity can be a design choice, not an accident, not nostalgia, not some mystical old car blessing from the gods of carburetors and bench seats. A choice. Make it simple, make it strong, make it repairable, make it safe enough that people want to keep fixing it. And if it ends up looking like a brick with seatbelts, honestly, even better. But even the toughest cars have 3 enemies, and they are not horsepower, speed, or age. They are much dumber than that, and those 3 enemies deserve their own little warning label. Because every time people say they do not make cars like they used to, somebody somewhere is standing beside a rusted out classic with a seized engine saying, "It was running when parked." Ah yes, the 4 most dangerous words in old car history. Here is the thing. No car on this list was literally built to last forever. Not the Toyota, not the Mercedes, not the Volvo, not the indestructible old sedan your uncle swears drove home with no coolant, 3 spark plugs, and a raccoon in the air cleaner. Durability is not immortality. Durability means the car gives you more chances before the consequences arrive with a clipboard. And the first boss fight is rust. Rust does not care how overbuilt the engine is. Rust does not read brochures. Rust attacks the structure. Floors, frame rails, rocker panels, suspension mounting points, brake lines, fuel lines, the important boring parts. The parts holding the whole steel sandwich together. An engine can run beautifully while the body is quietly turning into breakfast cereal underneath it. That is the cruel joke. A car can be mechanically healthy and structurally finished. The motor is ready for another 200,000 miles, and the chassis is ready to become yard art behind a barn. Congratulations. You have purchased a strong heart in a paper skeleton. Then comes neglect. Neglect is slower, quieter, and somehow even dumber. Oil turns into sludge, coolant loses its corrosion protection, timing belts age, hoses crack, transmission fluid gets cooked until it smells like regret. Grease fittings never see grease, filters become tiny museums of poor decisions, and old simple cars are forgiving. That is why people abuse them. They will tolerate missed services, cheap parts, cold starts, hot days, and owners who think maintenance means adding gas and vibes. But forgiveness is not the same thing as permission. Eventually, the bill shows up, and it is not interested in your childhood memories. Then there is the final boss, bad owners, not normal wear, not age, people. People who tow too much, rev cold engines, ignore warning lights, jump curbs, install mystery wiring, bypass safety systems, and fix fuel leaks with the confidence of someone who should not own matches. No engineer can fully design around a human being with pliers, electrical tape, and unlimited confidence. That is why the legends survived for a very specific reason. They were not magical. They were simple enough, strong enough, and repairable enough that normal people could keep them alive after normal people tried to ruin them. Real durability is restraint, overbuilding, excess, parts you can reach, systems that make sense, the glorious refusal to make everything more complicated than it needs to be. Revolutionary concept, right? So when we talk about cars built to last forever, what we really mean is this. They lasted longer because they gave owners a fighting chance. And speaking of cars designed around abuse, the next one spent decades being driven by cops, cabbies, and people who brake like furniture is optional. Enter the Ford Crown Victoria, a car so committed to being old-fashioned that by the end, it felt less like a sedan and more like a rolling government building. Big hood, big trunk, big bench seat energy. The kind of car that looked like it should come with a spotlight, a radio full of dispatch chatter, and one suspicious stain in the rear seat that nobody wanted to discuss. And here is the claim. The Crown Victoria lasted because Ford accidentally perfected the big, simple, body-on-frame American sedan right before America decided it wanted crossovers, computers, and cup holders shaped by wind tunnels. Bad timing for fashion, perfect timing for abuse. Underneath it was the Panther platform, shared with the Mercury Grand Marquis and Lincoln Town Car. And the formula was almost aggressively straightforward. V8 up front, rear-wheel drive in the back, a separate frame underneath, and enough empty space around the engine bay for a raccoon to open a repair shop. This mattered because police departments did not need delicate. Taxi companies did not need exciting. Fleet managers did not wake up in the morning saying, "You know what this city needs? A complicated drivetrain with special tools and emotional needs." No, they needed predictable. The Crown Vic was predictable in the way a brick is predictable. It did not handle like a sports car. It did not sip fuel like a compact. It did not whisper, "I am the future." It said, "I am large, I am thirsty, and I will be here on Tuesday." And for fleets, that was gold. The 4.6-liter modular V8 was not some exotic masterpiece with the personality of a museum exhibit. It was smooth, durable, and common enough that parts stores probably had components for it hiding under the counter next to the gum. Mechanics knew it. Shops had seen it. Nothing about it required a ceremonial robe and a laptop subscription from the moon. Then there was the body-on-frame construction. By the 2000s, most passenger cars had moved to unibody designs, where the body and structure are all one integrated shell, more modern, more efficient, better for packaging, very clever. The Crown Vic looked at that and said, "No thank you. I will continue being a small pickup truck wearing a sedan costume." That separate frame made it tough. Not invincible, but tough. It could take potholes, curb hits, long idle hours, hard launches, panic stops, and the daily spiritual violence of being driven by people who did not personally pay for the repairs. Who drives like that? Police officers, cab drivers, and municipal employees with a schedule. That is who. And when something did break, the repair usually made sense. Suspension parts were available. Brake parts were available. Engines and transmissions were familiar. Body panels existed by the million. Junkyards were basically Crown Victoria buffets for 20 years. That is the unglamorous secret. Fleet legends are not built only by surviving. They are built by being cheap enough to bring back after they stop surviving. A delicate car can be reliable until one expensive failure turns it into a financial hostage situation. The Crown Vic could get wounded, fixed, and sent back out like nothing happened. Door smashed? Replace it. Transmission tired? Swap it. Interior destroyed by a decade of passengers treating it like a rented dumpster? Congratulations. That was already part of the business model. And yes, let us be honest, it was not refined by modern standards. It floated, it leaned, it drank fuel like gasoline had offended its family. The steering was more suggestion than command. The interior plastics had all the luxury of a public school calculator. By the end, it was about as modern as a fax machine in a cowboy hat. But that was also the point. Ford did not keep reinventing it every 3 years. They refined the same basic idea until the bugs were known, the fixes were known, and the entire industry of maintenance had basically memorized the car by touch. That is why taxi companies loved them. A Crown Vic could idle for hours, crawl through city traffic, absorb potholes that looked legally classified as infrastructure crimes, and still come back for another shift. If it needed work, the downtime was manageable. If parts were needed, they were cheap. If a mechanic opened the hood, nobody had to summon a specialist named Lars with a diagnostic wand. That is real-world durability, not brochure durability, not tested on a proving ground by engineers in clean jackets durability. I mean the grimy kind, the kind measured in idle hours, curb scars, coffee spills, rear seat chaos, and odometers that kept rolling long after the upholstery had given up on dignity. The Crown Victoria did not survive because it was advanced. It survived because it was simple enough to understand, strong enough to abuse, and cheap enough to forgive. And if that sounds like faint praise, it is not. That is the whole trick. Restraint, overbuilding, repairability, the glorious refusal to make a basic job more complicated than it needs to be. When the last Crown Victoria rolled out in 2011, America did not just lose a car, it lost the final form of an entire species, the honest, rear-drive, body-on-frame sedan that could spend Monday as a police cruiser, Wednesday as a taxi, and Friday as a retired grandpa car with one hubcap and unlimited confidence. It was thirsty, it was floaty, it was outdated, and it absolutely refused to die on schedule. But what happens when reliability stops being cheap and starts wearing a luxury suit? Enter the Lexus LS 400. And this is where the whole durability conversation gets weird, because now we are not talking about simple old fleet machinery. We are talking about leather, silence, power seats, climate control, acres of wiring, and enough luxury car expectations to make a mechanic start pricing a boat. Normally, that is where reliability goes to be murdered, because old luxury cars have a reputation, a very specific reputation. They age from executive transportation into electrical haunted house with walnut trim. One day, the seat memory forgets where your spine is. Then a warning light appears in a language only bankruptcy attorneys understand. Then the suspension makes a noise like a haunted shopping cart. But the original Lexus LS 400 did something rude. It showed up in 1989 and basically asked Germany, what if a luxury car did not have to punish its owner for enjoying quiet? That was not just bold, that was culturally aggressive. Toyota had spent years developing this thing under a project so obsessive it sounded less like car building and more like a secret government program for people who alphabetized their socks. Thousands of engineers, hundreds of prototypes, ridiculous testing, tiny details studied until normal companies would have told everyone to please go outside and look at a tree. Who does that? Toyota, apparently, when it decides to embarrass the established luxury world. The heart of the LS400 was a 4-liter V8 called the 1UZ-FE, and it was the kind of engine that made smoothness feel suspicious. Aluminum construction, dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, and power delivery so calm it felt like the car was being pushed by a very polite, invisible giant. But here is the important part. It was not tuned within an inch of its life. It was not some stressed-out diva engine demanding exotic rituals and premium emotional support. It was smooth, strong, and understressed. The mechanical equivalent of a bodybuilder who also does your taxes and never raises his voice. That mattered because luxury owners got the sensation of expensive engineering without the usual side order of panic. Quiet cabin, smooth power, long highway legs, and odometers that climbed into wild territory while the car still started every morning like it had a meeting at 9 and no interest in drama. The real magic was not that the LS400 was simple. It was not. Compared with a Corolla, this thing was a spaceship wearing a business suit. It had more equipment, more sound insulation, more electronics, more everything. But the difference was that the complexity was engineered carefully instead of flung at the dashboard like spaghetti. That is the key. Toyota did not just add features and hope the warranty department had a strong stomach. They controlled the parts. They controlled the tolerances. They controlled the assembly process like someone had personally insulted the concept of panel gaps. The doors closed with that famous vault-like thunk. The engine idled so smoothly, people loved doing the old coin on the engine demonstration. The interior did not feel like it was assembled during a lunch break by a man named Gary who had lost the screws. Everything felt deliberate, and when these cars aged, they aged differently from a lot of European luxury machines of the same era. They still needed maintenance, obviously. Timing belts mattered, fluids mattered, suspension bushings did not become immortal just because the badge had an L on it. But they did not usually turn into rolling financial traps at the first sign of grey hair. That was the shock. An LS400 could have 200,000 miles, faded paint, a slightly tired driver's seat, and still cruise like it had just left a very quiet bank lobby. 300,000 miles was not fantasy. There are examples that have gone much farther, because the bones were right from the beginning. And this terrified the old guard for one very simple reason. Lexus removed the excuse. Before the LS, people accepted that luxury meant compromise. You got prestige, comfort, and performance, and in return the car occasionally demanded a tribute payment large enough to make your credit card sweat. Then Toyota arrived with a car that was refined, powerful, quiet, and absurdly durable. Not perfect, not magical, but proof that premium did not have to mean fragile. The LS400 changed expectations because it made reliability part of luxury, not the opposite of it. Suddenly, a luxury car could be judged not only by how it felt new, but by how gracefully it survived 10 years of real ownership. That is why this car belongs here. It was overbuilt in the places that mattered, restrained in the places where ego usually takes over, and assembled with the kind of quality control that felt slightly unwell in the best possible way. The Crown Victoria survived by being honest and simple. The Lexus LS400 survived by making complexity behave, but Germany was not exactly sitting around building decorative paperweights, and one Mercedes in particular became a legend for a reason. Then Mercedes rolled in with the W124, and suddenly the phrase "bank vault on wheels" stopped sounding like a lazy car review cliché and started sounding like a product description. This was the mid-1980s Mercedes-Benz E-Class, before it was officially called the E-Class, and it came from that magical period when Mercedes engineers appeared to believe planned obsolescence was a personal insult, not a business model, an insult. The W124 was not trying to be flashy. It was not trying to look like it had just escaped from a concept car brochure. It was square, serious, upright, and German in the way a tax form is German. Everything about it said, "I am here to complete the assignment and possibly judge your shoes." But underneath that sensible suit was one of the most overbuilt family car platforms ever sold to normal humans. The chassis was strong, the suspension was sophisticated without being ridiculous. The body structure felt like Mercedes had designed it by asking, what if the road is angry, and then preparing accordingly. And the engines? That is where the legend really starts making mechanics nod slowly. You had long-lived gasoline engines, tough diesels, and especially those diesel models that seemed less like engines and more like agricultural equipment that accidentally learned manners. They were not fast in the modern sense. Some of them accelerated with the urgency of a courthouse elevator. But they ran and ran and ran some more just to be annoying. Taxi fleets loved them because downtime is where money goes to die. Long-distance drivers loved them because the car felt planted, calm, and weirdly indifferent to mileage. Diesel owners loved them because the engine bay looked like something you could understand without a laptop, a subscription, and a priest. That was the trick. The W124 was engineered to be serviced, not worshipped from a distance, not thrown away when one electronic module got emotionally confused. Serviced. Parts came off, systems made sense. The mechanical pieces were conservative, durable, and built with the sort of material quality that made the whole car feel dense. Switches clicked clicked with purpose, doors shut with authority. Interior pieces did not feel like they were one sunny afternoon away from becoming cornflakes. It was not just durability. It was durability with manners. A tired old W124 could have faded paint, a sagging seat, 300,000 miles, and still feel like it had another shift to work. Not because it was magic, because the foundation was right. Strong structure, unstressed powertrains, good cooling, proper driveline components, and a general refusal to make every system clever just for the joy of future suffering. Now, nuance matters. These cars were not free to own. This was still a Mercedes. Parts could be expensive. Neglected suspension work could stack up. Rust could matter depending on climate. And if someone treated maintenance like an optional personality trait, the car would eventually respond with a bill written in fluent German. But that is the point. The W124 rewarded care. It did not punish you for existing. Give it oil changes, fluids, filters, bushings, brakes, and the normal respect any machine deserves, and it could pile on mileage until the odometer looked embarrassed to still be involved. That is why the W124 became such a global object of trust. Not because it was the simplest car ever made. It was more advanced than people remember, with aerodynamic work, refined suspension geometry, safety engineering, and build quality that did not happen by accident. But Mercedes kept the complexity in check. The cleverness served the car. It did not take over the car and start demanding tribute. Revolutionary concept, right? This is the high watermark people are usually talking about when they get misty-eyed about old Mercedes. Not because every single one was perfect, and not because nostalgia has never lied to anyone on the internet, but because the philosophy was different. Build it strong, make it repairable, use good materials, avoid drama. The W124 did not feel disposable because it was not designed with a trash can in mind. It felt like a machine built by people who expected it to still be working after owners changed, countries changed, fuel prices changed, and the original cassette collection became historically embarrassing. The Crown Victoria was the hammer. The Lexus LS400 was the quiet assassin. The Mercedes W124 was the executive bank vault that clocked in every morning, adjusted its tie, and refused to die. And then there is the vehicle that did not just survive roads, it survived places where roads had given up and gone home. And then Toyota built the vehicle you bought when the map started lying. The Toyota Land Cruiser did not become legendary because it was cute or luxurious or especially interested in your lower back comfort. It became legendary because in huge parts of the world, a breakdown is not a nuisance, it is a survival problem. A dead Land Cruiser in a city is annoying. A dead Land Cruiser in the desert, the mountains, the bush, a mine site, or a muddy track 200 miles from the nearest mechanic is a very different little adventure. That is when the tow truck is not coming, your phone has no signal, the sun is trying to cook you, and suddenly fuel economy feels like a hilarious concern from a softer civilization. This is why the old Land Cruiser earned the reputation it did. Toyota did not build it like a lifestyle accessory with a roof rack and a social media manager. Toyota built it for people who needed the thing to start every morning, carry weight, cross bad ground, drink questionable fuel, tolerate heat and dust, and then do it again tomorrow with the emotional range of a refrigerator. The formula was not mystical. Heavy-duty drivetrains, strong axles, simple engines, conservative engineering, parts that were not tuned to the edge of their lives just to win a brochure war. That was the real magic. Toyota left margin in the machine. The engines were often understressed, meaning they were not constantly being asked to perform circus tricks. The driveline components were built to take abuse. The cooling systems mattered because these things worked in places where the air itself felt hostile. The suspension was designed for load, not just showroom stance. And the axles, especially on older models, were the kind of strong, simple hardware that mechanics could understand without needing a laptop to have a private conversation with the vehicle. Revolutionary concept, right? And look who used them. Aid organizations, militaries, farmers, miners, explorers, remote communities, people who do not have time for a vehicle that says, actually, I am entering limp mode because a sensor saw a ghost. Who buys a vehicle because failure might turn into an international incident? Those people. That is why you see old Land Cruisers in places where the roads look like they were assembled during an argument. Africa, Australia, the Middle East, Latin America, mountain regions, desert tracks, jungle trails, job sites where every day is basically a stress test with paperwork. The Land Cruiser was not always refined. Some were loud, some were thirsty, some rode like Toyota had studied comfort and decided it was suspicious. But complaining about that is like criticizing a hammer for not being a sofa. That was not the assignment. The assignment was to get there, get back, and not turn your expedition into a cautionary documentary. And the cause and effect is obvious. Toyota made them durable and repairable, so hard-use customers trusted them. Those customers used them in brutal environments, which proved the design. That proof created the reputation, which made even more serious buyers choose them. It became a loop, not hype, evidence. Now, were they literally immortal? No. Rust can eat them. Neglect can kill them. Abuse can eventually defeat anything, because humans are creative and sometimes terrible at maintenance. But the old Land Cruiser gave you a fighting chance. It was not delicate, it was not fussy, it did not need perfect conditions to behave like a useful machine. It was built with restraint, over-engineering, and a glorious refusal to make everything more complicated than it needed to be. That is why the Land Cruiser feels different from normal car nostalgia. People do not just remember that it lasted, they remember where it lasted, loaded with supplies, caked in dust, pulling through ruts, idling in heat, carrying families, tools, medicine, soldiers, crops, and sometimes an entire village's confidence that tomorrow was still going to happen. That is not just a vehicle, that is mechanical trust with 4 wheels and a transfer case. But the number one spot goes to a car so legendarily stubborn that taxi drivers turned it into rolling proof that Mercedes once built machines for geological time. And then Mercedes built the car that made odometers look like cowards. The W123 is the kind of machine that turns normal mileage into a joke. 200,000 miles, cute. 300,000, still stretching. 500,000, now we are having a conversation. And in taxi service, especially in diesel form, these things could push toward mileage that sounds less like car ownership and more like a long-term geological event. This is the Mercedes-Benz W123, built from the mid-1970s into the mid-1980s. It was not designed to be flashy. It was not trying to impress the neighbors with mood lighting, giant screens, or a dashboard that needs a software update before you can turn on the fan. No. It was built like Mercedes looked at a normal family sedan and said, what if we made this suspiciously close to a bank vault? And trust me, they did. The doors closed with that deep, expensive thunk. Not a tinny clack, not a plastic rattle, a thunk. The kind of sound that makes you believe the door has its own pension plan. The body structure was stout, the suspension was durable. The interior materials were chosen with the assumption that human beings are disgusting, impatient, and will absolutely spill coffee on everything. But the real legend lived under the hood, especially with the diesel engines. The W123 diesels were not fast. Let us be honest. Some of them accelerated like they were considering the request and would get back to you in writing. You did not floor a 240D and experience drama. You experienced commitment. A hill appeared and the car said, fine, but nobody panic. But that was the point. These engines were understressed. They were not squeezing every last ounce of power out of tiny parts running at the edge of disaster. They were slow-turning, heavy-duty, mechanically straightforward engines that seemed to run on diesel, patience, and spite. And that is why they lasted. Less stress means less heat. Less heat means less wear. Simple mechanical injection meant fewer electronic tantrums. Big internal components meant the engine was not living every day like it owed money to a loan shark. The transmissions were just as important. Mercedes automatics from this era were not delicate little glass ornaments. They were built to handle work. The manuals were simple and tough, and when something did wear out, mechanics could actually fix it without plugging in a computer and waiting for the car to confess its feelings. Revolutionary concept, right? This is where taxi fleets enter the story, because taxi drivers do not care about your brochure. They care about uptime. They care about fuel cost. They care about whether the car starts at 4 in the morning, idles all day, survives bad roads, bad traffic, bad weather, bad passengers, and then comes back tomorrow ready for more abuse. In Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and plenty of other places, the W123 became a taxi icon because it made economic sense. You could service it repeatedly, repair it economically, keep sending it back into duty like nothing happened. That is not romance. That is cause and effect. Mercedes built a conservative, over-engineered car with durable engines and repairable systems. Taxi fleets punished those cars with ridiculous mileage. The cars kept working. The reputation became impossible to ignore. And no, the W123 was not immortal. Rust could get it. Neglect could get it. Bad maintenance could turn even this thing into a very dignified paperweight. But the difference was that the car gave owners a massive margin for survival. It did not need perfect conditions. It needed oil changes, filters, valve adjustments, decent fuel, and someone with basic mechanical sense. That was the deal. Maintain it, and it would keep grinding forward with the emotional warmth of industrial equipment. And honestly, that is why it may be the clearest example on this entire list. The W123 was not legendary because Mercedes accidentally built magic. It was legendary because almost every major design choice favored longevity over flash. Strong body, simple systems, under-stress diesel engines, durable drivetrains, real repairability. It was restrained with a three-pointed star, a car from an era when premium did not mean complicated for no reason. Premium meant it felt solid, worked for decades, and could survive a life that would reduce a lesser sedan to loose trim and regret. So if the formula was this clear, why did so many cars stop being built this way? Because the world changed, not a little, completely. Cars did not become complex because engineers woke up one morning and said, you know what drivers need? A headlight module that costs more than an entire running Corolla from 1996. Although, some days, it does feel like that. Modern cars are safer. That part matters. Airbags, crumple zones, stability control, anti-lock brakes, backup cameras, blind spot monitoring, stronger crash structures. These things save real people in real wrecks. And honestly, good. I like surviving. Big fan. They are also cleaner, more efficient, faster, quieter, more comfortable. A modern economy car can cruise at highway speed with air conditioning on, music playing, phones charging, and enough computer power on board to make an 80s luxury sedan look like a toaster with seats. Progress is not the villain. Let me say that clearly before someone throws a carburetor through the comments section. The villain is disposable complexity. That special kind of complexity where everything works beautifully until it does not. And then the repair involves a scan tool, a subscription, a sealed unit, a plastic clip made of sadness, and a service bill that makes you briefly consider becoming Amish. That is the difference. A simple old car could fail in obvious ways. It would cough, leak, smoke, rattle, refuse to start with the dramatic timing of a stage actor. But a normal mechanic could usually chase the problem with tools, experience, and the ancient diagnostic method known as looking at the thing. Fuel, spark, compression, air, timing, basic stuff. Modern failures can be invisible. A sensor lies to a module. The module panics. Another module believes the first module. The dashboard lights up like a casino carpet. The car goes into limp mode because one tiny electronic gremlin had a bad morning. And now you are not repairing a machine. You are negotiating with a nervous robot. This is why those old legends survived so long. The Beetle, the Corolla, the Volvo, the Crown Victoria, the Lexus, the Land Cruiser, the old Mercedes diesels, they were not perfect. Some were slow, some were loud, some rusted if you looked at them near salt. Some had the safety equipment of a folding chair in a thunderstorm, but they left room for human imperfection. That is the part people forget. They left room for late oil changes, bad roads, cheap fuel, owners who ignored noises until the noises formed a union, mechanics working in small garages, taxi drivers hammering them all day, families stretching a car payment into a decade of ownership because replacing the car was not an option. These cars had margins, big ones. Engines were understressed, transmissions were not asked to perform interpretive dance for fuel economy. Interiors used knobs, cables, switches, and materials that could take abuse. Suspensions were serviceable. Parts could be removed without dismantling half the front end like you were defusing a bomb in a submarine. And that restraint mattered, because durability is not just strength, it is accessibility, it is repairability, it is the ability to fix one broken piece instead of replacing an entire sealed assembly, because the tiny part inside costs $12 but lives inside a $500 plastic coffin. Who designed that? Someone optimizing a supply chain, that is who. And to be fair, car companies are under pressure from every direction. Buyers want touch screens, regulators want lower emissions, crash tests get harder, fuel economy standards get tighter, luxury features trickle down. Everyone wants heated seats, lane assist, turbo power, quiet cabins, panoramic roofs, wireless everything, and 12 drive modes for going to the grocery store. Then we act shocked when the car has more wiring than a small office building. This is the trade. Modern cars gained brilliance. They gained protection. They gained performance that would make old muscle cars sweat through their vinyl seats. But many lost mercy. Mercy for owners who cannot afford dealer-only repairs. Mercy for independent mechanics. Mercy for the second, third, and fourth owners. Mercy for the idea that a machine should be understandable by the person depending on it. That is why old forever cars feel different. Not because the past was automatically better. It was not. The past had drum brakes, weak headlights, no airbags, rust-proofing that sometimes seemed theoretical, and interiors that could become sun-baked crime scenes after one hot summer. But the best old cars had a kind of honesty. They did fewer things, so they had fewer ways to fail. They were overbuilt where it counted and plain where plain was enough. They did not try to turn every commute into a software ecosystem with cup holders. And that is the bigger meaning here. Real durability is restraint. It is knowing when not to add another system, when not to chase one more horsepower number, when not to hide simple parts behind complicated packaging, when not to make a car so clever that 10 years later, nobody can afford to keep it clever. Because forever cars were not actually forever. They just gave ordinary people a fighting chance. Which brings us back to that battered old car in the opening. Still running, still ugly, still making a point. So no, these cars were not built by wizards. There was no secret meeting in a candlelit factory where engineers poured immortality into a crankcase and whispered, "Go forth, little sedan, and haunt Craigslist forever." The answer is less magical and way more interesting. They lasted because they were simple where they could be simple, overbuilt where they had to be strong, and repairable enough that normal humans could keep dragging them back from the edge, again and again and again. The Volkswagen Beetle did it with almost ridiculous simplicity, an air-cooled engine, basic parts, and the mechanical complexity of a lawn chair with ambition. The Peugeot 504 did it with toughness, bad roads, bad fuel, hard use, hot climates, and it just kept clattering along like it had a personal grudge against retirement. The old Hondas did it with consistency, not drama, not flash, just tight engineering, clean layouts, and engines that seemed personally offended by neglect. The Toyota Corolla did it by being boring in the most powerful way possible. No ego, no nonsense, just start, drive, repeat, until everyone forgot how old it was. The Volvo 200 series brought pure brick energy, square, safe, stubborn, and built like the design brief was make a car that can survive both winter and teenagers. The Crown Victoria took fleet abuse like it was a paid hobby. Police departments, taxi companies, government garages, potholes, idling, curb hits, suspicious smells. It saw everything. It judged nothing. The Lexus LS 400 proved that luxury could be reliable if a company became obsessively allergic to failure. Quiet, smooth, over-engineered, and somehow more disciplined than most people's retirement plans. The Mercedes W124 had that old-school solidity. Doors that shut like bank vaults. Diesel engines that treated mileage like a rumor. A car from the era when Mercedes still seemed to ask, what if we made this expensive but also indestructible? The Land Cruiser became the remote survival legend, not because it was fancy, but because in places where breaking down is not inconvenient, it is a plot twist with vultures, people trusted it. And the Mercedes W123 gave us million-mile dignity, taxis, families, long-distance drivers, and diesel engines that just kept going with the calm confidence of a refrigerator in a suit. Different cars, same basic philosophy. Do the important things well. Do not make every part fragile. Leave room for maintenance. Leave room for bad owners. Leave room for life. That is the open loop answered. These cars did not last forever because they were perfect. They survived because they outstubborned time. They were machines with margins, built before every component had to be lighter, smarter, quieter, safer, cleaner, cheaper, more connected, and somehow also controlled by a tiny plastic module hiding behind the dashboard like a villain in a submarine movie. And that is why the phrase still hits. They do not make many cars exactly like this anymore. Not because engineers forgot how, because the world asked cars to be more than transportation. We asked them to be safety cages, entertainment centers, emission laboratories, mobile offices, heated living rooms, rolling computers, and occasionally, yes, cars. That trade gave us amazing machines, but it made the simple forever car rarer. So now I want to hear from you. What old car have you seen refuse to die? Which one did I miss? And be honest, would you rather own a simple forever car with crank windows and a stubborn engine, or a modern spaceship with heated everything and a dashboard that looks like mission control? Drop it in the comments. If you enjoyed this ride, hit the like button, subscribe for more from Ben at USA Classic Cars, and thanks for watching. Because sometimes the most impressive car is not the fastest one. It is the one that should have quit 200,000 miles ago, but apparently did not get the memo.